I'm here in Nantucket. And in Nantucket, you always have fantastic speakers. And yesterday we had a presentation of John Holdren. And John Holdren is a climate change expert. And he was served as President Barack Obama's Chief Science and Technology Advisor and the Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology. John, yesterday you talked about the climate change, and all the presentations are online. I will put a note into where you can see a fantastic presentation of him at Brown, and the slides will be there. But if we review quickly on climate change, what do we know now?
Well, what we know, first of all, is the climate is changing in ways that cannot be explained by natural influences. In fact, it's changing in the opposite direction from the current effects of natural influences. Natural influences would be cooling the Earth, except that the human influences have overwhelmed them.
Yeah, we're going for an ice. We're going for an ice age, but we fixed that.
For an ice age, but we fixed it and we overcompensated because the heat-trapping gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and others, are warming the Earth far more than the natural forces are cooling it. And so the world is warming. It's warming unevenly, so that the far north, the Arctic, is warming 2 to 5 times faster than the average. The centers of continents are warming faster than the average. The West Antarctic ice sheet is warming faster than the average. And the fact that it is uneven is affecting the patterns of climate all around the world, not just the average temperature, but the circulation of the atmosphere, the winds, the ocean, all changing under climate change.
Yeah, and that is pretty much, and then you have a lot of slides where you basically describe that and also the consequences. It was nice what you said. It's like the body of your body. If your body goes, temperature goes from 37 degrees Celsius to 39, you are in big trouble, and that's also with the Earth. Yeah.
What that tells you, when the temperature goes up a little bit, whether it's your body or the planet, it's telling you there's a big problem in the underlying system. The temperature is just a crude index of what's going on in that very complicated system. Now, the second thing we know, without question, is that it is human activities that have caused this. It's fossil fuel burning and land use change. There is absolutely no scientific doubt about that. The third thing we know is that there is already significant damage being done by climate change. We know that it's not just a problem for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We're already seeing increases in deadly heat waves, in large wildfires, in powerful storms, in lightning strikes, in torrential downpours and floods, in the bleaching of coral reefs, in the loss of biodiversity. All of these impacts of climate change are already happening, and they are very well matched to what is expected from the kinds of changes in climate that human activities have produced. That is, the timing, the spatial distribution, what we call the fingerprint of these different impacts matches.
It's very clear who's guilty, and it's us.
And it's clear that harm is already being done. It's also clear that more harm will be done before we can stop it. Even if we act aggressively, you cannot stop climate change in its tracks.
Okay. What do we know? That's basically the modeling. What's going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, what we know is the temperature will continue to rise, although we have some control over how fast. If we take aggressive action to reduce the offending emissions and to reduce the land use practices that are contributing to the addition of these heat-trapping gases, then the rise can be relatively slow, and perhaps we could stop the temperature increase at about 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. Right now we're at about 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level, and we're already, as I've mentioned, seeing very serious consequences. So it's not that 2 degrees is safe, but it's much safer than 3 or 4.
Yeah. Or like you said yesterday, said 5, 6, 7, 8 degrees.
And a world that is 4 or 5 degrees C, never mind 6 or 8 degrees C warmer than pre-industrial, would be an unrecognizable world. It would be impossible to work outside in the warmest part of the year in many parts of the world, impossible to do agriculture, construction, fisheries, because to work outside would mean heat stroke and dying. It would be a world in which much of the biodiversity is gone, in which food production would have dropped. It would be a world in which sea level has gone up in this century maybe as much as 2 meters. at the high end.
For the Netherlands, that would be quite dramatic. Yeah.
And it would be quite dramatic for coastlines all around the world. If you look at what 1 meter of sea level rise means for the east coast of the United States, it would be devastating. So we have the choice. The biggest uncertainty about the future of climate change is not uncertainty in the science. It's uncertainty about what society decides to do. If we do a lot, maybe we can keep it to 2 degrees Celsius increase. If we don't do a lot, we're certainly looking at 3 or 4 and maybe 5 or 6, and that would be a disaster.
I would say that please take a look at that presentation, because you went into that in great detail, and also what we can do ourselves to stop that and get into the 2 degrees, and from all the different actors. I want to go into first. I want to ask you. You started in 1969, okay, to talking about this. Describe 69 and what happens now. I mean, how did people? How is the awareness? How has it changed? And is it real awareness, or is it just that people are talking? How much do we feel really this urgency at the moment?
Well, first of all, in 1969, scientists were talking about this issue, but no one else was, and with a few exceptions. That is, in the 60s, there was a report by what was called the President's Science Advisory Committee to the President of the United States that said that continuing additions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere from human activities would eventually change the climate, and that this could be disastrous. But there was no public conversation about this. Nobody.
We have a report from Shell. You know, we have a little oil company,
Yes.
and the research center of Shell
Right.
also published this published an article about that this was going to we could not be able to reverse it. That report was later disconnected, but emerged again. Yeah.
No, very famously, a Swedish scientist named Arrhenius wrote a paper in 1895 predicting that a doubling of the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere would increase the temperature of the Earth by about 5 degrees Celsius. 1895. But again, nobody but
How many parts per million did we have at that moment?
At that moment in 1895, it was not much above the pre-industrial level. It was maybe 290, 295 parts per million. Now we're at about 415 parts per million. The number that represents a doubling from the pre-industrial level is 550 parts.
When will we reach that? And when we have this? When we have conditions like now.
The big uncertainty is whether we will do anything. But if we don't do anything, we're going to have 550 by 2040 or so.
So what you're saying, it was scientists talking about it, and how would you describe it? How would you describe it now if we talk about 2018?
Well, today, what polls show is that in the United States, about 70% of the public now believe that the climate is changing, that it's already doing harm, that people are responsible, and we need to do something about it. 70%.
Including Republicans.
This is polls of all voters, and that includes Republicans. The fraction in the Congress of the United States among the Republicans is about half that. That is, it's about 35% of Republicans in the Congress will admit, at least. More may know it, but only about a third, a little more than a third, will admit it. But in the public, the percentage is higher. The problem is that this challenge is not very high on the priority list of most people. So if you ask them a different question, if you say, what are you most worried about? What keeps you awake at night? Jobs, income, getting their kids through college, health care, retirement, crime, drugs. So
much more closer to the chest are much more important.
So from the political standpoint today, the problem about getting political action on climate change is that it is not a high enough priority for most people. There's a dedicated group that's probably about 30% as opposed to 70% who rank climate change higher and are the people who are driving the public discussion. They're driving movements like America's Pledge, We're Still In, which is the collection of businesses and non-governmental organizations and universities and cities and states that say, even though President Trump is withdrawing from the Paris Accords, we're still in. And that's, again, that's what you might call the hardcore.
What we see in Europe as the as the positive thing which comes out of it, that a lot of people just stood up and said, "Hey, we're going to do this," because of course we in Europe we started in 2000 with the pledge of the 2%, and we're slowly taking action, and we're really in the Netherlands we're really now planning the 50% reduction of CO2 and the 90% reduction, and it's in the government and it's in the official papers, etc. Can I ask you? You went from science to having a research institution. You know, you have one of the oldest research institution on climate change, and then you went into the government. How serious is the subject there? I mean, in the 8 years that you were with the Obama time.
In the Obama administration, it was extremely serious. When Obama was campaigning, he said he was going to give very high priority to climate change. During his administration, he said many times that he thought climate change was ultimately going to be the most serious challenge that the whole world faces in the 21st century, and he acted on that. He
was extremely serious about it.
Extremely serious. He was extremely knowledgeable. He was extremely curious about the details. He and I had many conversations about the cutting edge of climate science and what
he knew his stuff.
He knew his stuff. But he didn't just know his stuff. He was always determined to figure out how we could act effectively on it, how we could move an agenda forward that would address climate change, both from the standpoint of what we call mitigation, the steps you take to reduce the emissions and reduce the activities that are driving climate change, and what we call adaptation, the steps that you take to reduce the damage from the changes in climate that you do not succeed in avoiding. He was very strongly in favor of both. He lifted up adaptation to equal status with mitigation in the U.S. government policies. He issued executive orders that required every department and agency of the federal government to embed climate change in all of their planning, their policies, and their programs. We instituted major initiatives to control methane emissions, to control carbon dioxide emissions, to assist other countries as well as our own states and cities in investing in preparedness and resilience for the changes in climate already going on. The unfortunate thing is we really never got much support from the United States Congress. The only thing we could get out of Congress was some increase in research and development on clean and efficient energy. And
everything was done with executive orders, and now Trump does a good... Before we get that, I just want to get more into the atmosphere and how people and how people were thinking about it. How did you and Obama get to know each other, and why were you asked to fulfill that role?
I met Obama when he was a United States Senator, and I met him because he wanted to learn more about the details of climate change, and he asked his political director to assemble 8 people who were knowledgeable from different points of view about climate change. So we had 2 professors, of whom I was one. We had the heads of 2 environmental organizations. We had 2 business leaders, one an oil company president, the other an electric power company president, and we had 2 people who had experience in climate issues in government in previous.
What an interesting group together.
And he brought that group of people together for a 3-hour dinner in a private room in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. I had the great good fortune to sit next to him. We had an initial conversation of about 15 minutes before he opened up the discussion in the whole table for the next 3 hours about climate change. And he extracted from these 8 people the key insights that each had to offer. And then at the end of the evening, he'd taken no notes. At the end of the evening, he said, well, let me see if I got this right. Here's what I heard. And he produced, speaking in complete sentences and paragraphs, again with no notes, a synthesis that was better than the conversation. And after that,
you were sold.
I was sold. And after that, from time to time, his staff would ask me to look at drafts of speeches he was going to give on energy, on climate change, on nuclear weapons, which is another area in which I had worked. And I would comment on those speeches. Sometimes I would write a paragraph for him. And then during the campaign, when he was running for president, he formed a group of advisors on energy and climate change, about half a dozen people. It was led by Carol Browner, who had been the head of the Environmental Protection Agency in the Clinton administration, and we met regularly, and we met with the candidate regularly. So I had some considerable interaction with him even before he was elected. And after he was elected, he invited me to Chicago, to his headquarters, to talk about possible jobs in the administration. He invited a lot of other people to talk about jobs in the administration. He asked me what job I wanted, and I said I would love to be your science and technology advisor. And in the end, 10 days later, I got the call that said, you got the job. So
you had a research institution where you were the director. You had to let that go, or you had to basically.
At that time, I was a professor at Harvard in two different departments: the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, teaching environmental science, and the Harvard Kennedy School, the Kennedy School of Government, teaching science and public policy, climate policy, energy policy, and so on. And I was the director of the program on science, technology, and public policy at the Kennedy School. And I was the director of the independent nonprofit Woods Hole Research Center in Woods Hole, which for the last 4 years in a row has been declared the top independent climate change think tank in the world.
Independent?
Independent. It doesn't belong to any university. It's independent. It's nonprofit. But I directed that for only about 3.5 years before going into the Obama administration. So I had to abandon all of that. When you're the science and technology advisor to the president or any other senior staff position in the White House, you belong to the president 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. You officially have no time off, no weekends, no vacation, which my wife...
Your family and your kids really enjoyed that period.
That was not a great period for family life, and it's not that you couldn't go home, but you could never be out of touch. If you went home for the weekend, the White House had to have a phone number where you could be reached every minute in case the president needed your advice. You could go on vacation, but you had to be someplace where you could be in touch by phone.
So describe, except for that it was extremely busy and a lot of hours and you had to be available, describe your job. What did you do every day, the 8 years?
Well, I was the head of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I had, in the end, about 135 people working for me, supporting the missions of that office. And those missions include, first of all, making sure that the president and his other senior advisors have the insights about science and technology that relate to whatever policy issues are on their plate. So it could be science and technology for the economy, science and technology for public health, science and technology for a sustainable energy future, science and technology for national defense and homeland security. So we had something in the range of 70 different major topics that we had to be on top of in case the president or his other senior advisors wanted advice on that.
What was next to Obama? What were the three most important people who were interested in science and technology in the Obama administration?
Well, first of all, the president himself. Secondly, the vice president. Yeah. And third, he had about 6 different chiefs of staff during the course of the 8 years. The last one was the longest serving one, Dennis McDonough. Dennis was extremely interested in science and technology, which is very important because the chief of staff is really the most important person in the White House after the president and vice president. Having a chief of staff who's interested in science and technology was important. But most important of all was that the president made clear to everyone in his cabinet and everyone on his staff that he was interested in how science and technology can help advance every issue on his agenda. And so the folks working on science and technology, including me, but also including all of my deputies and all of my staff, got great respect in the White House because the president made it clear that he respected those domains. And that's what's most important. If you have a president who doesn't care about science and technology, and we certainly have that at the moment in President Trump, but George W. Bush also didn't care much about science and technology. So it really all hinges on the president. President Clinton and Vice President Gore cared about it a lot. In that administration, I was a member of what's called the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, who are leaders from the science and technology community that keep their day jobs and only advise the White House on a part-time basis. So
So he basically cared a lot. So give me a couple of moments that you say, hey, then I did work, because I mean, in general, you were considered a very important part of the solution. But give me a couple of moments where you say, this is what we did at that time with our group of people, and that really mattered.
Well, of course, the Climate Action Plan that the President rolled out in June of 2013, which was the most comprehensive approach ever put out in the United States to address climate change in all of its aspects, both mitigation and adaptation. That plan was a joint effort by my office, by the Office of Energy and Climate Change in the White House, by the Department of Energy, by the Environmental Protection Agency. We all worked very closely together. The President paid extraordinary attention. We had many meetings with the President about the details. He made the final decisions about what was going to go in. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, which I co-chaired, made input on that, which very closely anticipated what would actually be in the Climate Action Plan. That, I think, was a big success. But we had other big successes in the biomedical space. We had an initiative on combating antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which originated in my office. We had an initiative on the brain, on how to improve imaging of the brain to better understand illnesses of the brain, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, to better understand traumatic brain injury, to better understand learning. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year, both from the government and from philanthropy, went into the BRAIN initiative. We had a national strategic computing initiative, which the President asked me to lead the development of, and which in its initial budget, $200 million a year to advance strategic computing for science, for the economy, and for national security. We had literally dozens of initiatives that were centered around science and technology, which were either composed in my office or composed by my office in partnership with other federal departments and agencies.
So that looks like an amazing time. I mean, you had your ideas, you had your passion, you had a president who wanted to listen, but you also had a Congress which really didn't, which had a lot of things which they didn't want to support. Yeah. How frustrating is it to be on top of the world, to be very close to making real solutions, and on the other hand, you know, having things which stop you?
Well, let me say, first of all, in fairness, that there were some things that the Congress agreed to. They agreed to the various biomedical initiatives because, of course, members of Congress, whatever their party, have family members who are suffering from cancer, who are suffering from diseases of the brain, and
they were not politically problematic.
And they supported those initiatives. They supported the Strategic Computing Initiative to the tune of $200 million a year in the budget, because they understood that advanced computing is important to the economy and important to national security. Some of them may not have cared that it's also important to science, but they were willing to pay for it. They were willing to pay for the Precision Medicine Initiative, which was an initiative looking at how you could combine electronic health records, big data analytics, genomic information, information about people's microbiomes in a way that would enable us to better tailor therapies, preventive measures to the individual characteristics of the patient, rather than looking for a one-size-fits-all approach. The Congress bought that.
What things? So there were things which they support, which were not politically problematic. What they didn't buy off.
What they didn't buy, we wanted big increases in basic research. We didn't get the Congress to buy that. We managed to hold the basic research budget of the federal government roughly constant, but we wanted to increase it, and the Congress wouldn't buy it. We wanted to drastically increase research on clean and efficient energy to move toward a carbon-free economy, and they supported some of that, but not nearly as much as we wanted, as we asked for. We wanted to increase climate change research and monitoring of the climate, because even though we know the basics of what's happening. We need a more detailed understanding going forward if we're to provide the information to states, to cities, to businesses, to individuals to take the actions that they need to take to protect themselves. And so we did not get the size of the increases in that domain that we wanted. And most importantly, we couldn't get a carbon tax or its equivalent in a cap and trade approach, a national cap and trade approach, out of the Congress. Once the Republicans took over both houses in the 2010 midterm elections, there was no longer any chance of doing that. And so the whole focus after the 2010 elections on climate change was, what can we do with executive authority? What can we do with the powers that the cabinet departments, the agencies, the White House itself possess?
Within the current budget, because increasing budgets.
Within the budgets we could get, yes.
So describe your daily role. I mean, how you get into the White House, and what time were people there? How long did they work, and what was your role during the day?
I usually got in at about 6:30 in the morning. Sometimes at 6.
You got up at?
I typically went home at sometime between 8:30 and 10 at night. Every day was different because, again, we had these many responsibilities. I had the responsibility for U.S. science and technology cooperation with 6 countries with whom we have what we call ministerial level science and technology cooperation agreements. Those are Brazil, China, India, Russia, Japan, and Korea.
That's a lot of time zones.
A lot of time zones. But I also had responsibility for communication with the science ministers in the European Union, in the OECD, in the G20. I had the responsibility for communicating to the wider United States science and technology community the priorities of the president, why we were doing what we were doing, the help that we needed from that wider community. I had the responsibility for persuading the Congress to vote for as much as possible of the president's science and technology budget. So
how did they like you if you came there? I mean, were you considered as a neutral scientist, or were they more against you?
It depends on the they. In the Obama administration, unfortunately, nobody was considered neutral. The Republicans were determined, and in fact, the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said explicitly that the role of the Congress, in his view, was to make the Obama presidency fail, to make it fail. And so whatever Obama was for, they were against. And so when I would go and testify before Congress, usually the Republicans on the committee before which I was testifying would try to embarrass me. They would make opening statements that criticized whatever the Obama administration was doing in the domain I was testifying about. They would ask questions that were designed to try to show that there was no scientific basis for the president's positions. That was particularly true about climate change, where the Republicans asked some really dumb questions. In fact, in one of my testimonies before Congress, where a video had been made, Jon Stewart, who had the Daily Show, the comedy show that sort of mimicked news, made a 10-minute segment of my video answering these questions, in which Jon Stewart ridiculed.
I'm going to watch that video. That's going to be so much fun.
You can still find it. And, one of them said, well, we have almost 400 parts per million now, but how many parts per million does it take to kill someone? Of carbon dioxide. And of course, the problem with carbon dioxide, unless it's in enormous quantities, is not that you'll suffocate, it's that it's changing the climate in ways that are doing damage.
The Congress is really very famous for asking stupid questions. Like when they did Mark Zuckerberg, they investigate, how can you offer all these services for free? Yeah. Mr. Congressman, we sell ads. Yeah, that was so classic. I mean, So, I mean, do you now? I mean, they are against you because of power of strategy. How when you talk to these people individually, how normal are they?
Well, they're much more normal individually. They're much friendlier individually. Often they would apologize in private for how nasty they were in the hearing. It's perfectly obvious that the hearings are in part a circus and an opportunity for members of Congress to play act for their base, for their strongest supporters. So whatever they think their base wants, they will make sure to get that into their comments in the hearing. And again, often they were very friendly outside the hearing. Some of my most venomous critics in the Republican Congress
were a beer with them.
Yeah, were extremely friendly outside of the hearings.
Did you learn quickly?
I went to events with them. One of the most notorious Republican members who was always attacking me with crazy questions, Dana Rohrabacher from Southern California, went with me to the landing of the Mars Curiosity rover. And we were both in the control room at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California. And he brought his nephew and introduced his nephew to me. He was so proud that he knew the science advisor to the President of the United States. This is a guy trying to lacerate me in front of the cameras. But
were you prepared for that? I mean, how long did it take you to become good at this?
Well, I knew a fair amount about it because I had been involved in various forms of policy advice to government for many years. I had testified before Congress long before I was Obama's science advisor on a number of topics. And I remember one friend of mine, Don Kennedy, who had been the head of the Food and Drug Administration, told me once that the one thing you need to understand about congressional hearings is you go in there, you get beat up for 4 hours, and then you go back to your office and do your job. And that's what you need to understand about congressional hearings.
And it's designed that way. That's how it's supposed to be.
But we had much more success when we did have success with Congress in individual meetings. And I met individually with many Republican members as well as with many Democratic members. And in some of those meetings, I persuaded Republicans to support what we were trying to do. So we did get some support on some important issues. Again, strategic computing, the biomedical initiatives, the brain, precision medicine, combating antibiotic resistance. Those things we got support from the Congress.
Let's go back to one very crucial moment, and that's basically the Paris Accord. That's one of the biggest successes of Obama. And you said that you've been working with the Chinese for a long time, and they had a certain position on what they think that who caused climate change and who should fix it. But at a certain point, we had Obama and the president of China declaring that this was important and needed to be done. Can you tell us behind the scenes how that process worked?
Yeah, there was a very long process leading up to that, a process that was literally decades long, in which Chinese scientists and Chinese officials met with American scientists and officials in private, both in China and in the United States, discussing these matters. And when we started these kinds of discussions, which was really in the early 1990s, the Chinese position was that global climate change is real, but it's a problem that was caused mainly by the industrialized nations. That most of the stuff in the atmosphere that was causing this problem was put there by the industrialized nations in the process of their getting rich, and it was completely inappropriate for them to tell the developing countries, now there's no room left in the atmosphere for your emissions, so you have to stop.
Yeah. Sounds like a reasonable point of view.
It is a reasonable point of view from the historical standpoint. And my response to that was to say to the Chinese, you're exactly right. The industrialized countries did cause most of it. The industrialized countries do have an obligation to lead in the solution, but you are going to need to join because your emissions are rising rapidly. And if you don't join, if China doesn't join, if India doesn't join in the effort to reduce these emissions, ultimately that effort will fail and we will all suffer. And that argument became steadily more powerful with the Chinese as the impacts of climate change in China began to be felt. And by the early 2000s, the community of Chinese climate scientists had concluded that global climate change was affecting the West Asian monsoon in a manner that was having adverse impacts on agriculture in China in a very significant way. The other thing that, of course, they very quickly figured out is they had a big problem with conventional pollution, with fine particles in the atmosphere from burning smoke and biofuels, with sulfur oxides, with nitrogen oxides.
Every 5 days, they had a new coal plant coming online.
And they figured out, of course, because it was obvious, that what they needed to do to reduce this conventional pollution and the damage it was doing to health in China was also going to help with the climate change problem. And so they became steadily more positive about China playing a significant role. They continued in the public rhetoric of the decision makers. They continued to use this line that it's mainly the fault of the industrialized countries, and the industrialized countries are going to have to lead. But privately, we were having extensive conversations, including calculations of when it would be possible for China to peak their emissions, to reduce their coal consumption. And the date that they were willing to talk about kept getting closer. That is, in the late 1990s, they were saying, well, maybe 2050. By the early 2000s, they were saying maybe 2040. By 2010, they were saying maybe 2035. And but all privately. But when finally, in November 2014, President Obama and President Xi stood up in Beijing and announced both countries' goals for reducing emissions and saying we're the two biggest economies, we're the two biggest emitters, we recognize this is an enormous global challenge, and we are prepared, both of us, to lead. That came out of dozens and dozens of meetings over the years, and more intensively leading up to that particular event. And so it was a very long and very arduous process, but
it must have been a great moment when you were you there? Were you there?
I did not go there. I did go to Paris, but I didn't go with the president.
You did not go to Paris? How is that possible?
I did go to Paris. I didn't go to Beijing.
Oh, you didn't.
I did go to Paris, but I didn't go to Beijing. But one of my deputies, who is an expert on energy and climate policy in China and speaks Mandarin, had taken a sabbatical leave from her university position to work with us in the White House. She worked for me and for John Podesta in the White House, and she worked for Todd Stern, our chief climate negotiator in the State Department, and she went. Kelly Gallagher, Professor Kelly Gallagher, who is at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, full professor, the head of their Global Environment Research Center. She was once my student, and she was instrumental behind the scenes in this process. Her name is not a household word, but among people who understand the history of climate negotiations with China, she is a household word.
Fantastic. How was Paris for you?
Well, Paris was also very exciting, obviously. And the president was there for the first part of the Paris meeting. But what happened, again, that not everybody knows, is that after the president left Paris and the negotiations were still going on, he was on the telephone every day to heads of state who we needed to keep on the team.
Like who?
And particularly Prime Minister Modi of India. There was great worry that India was going to jump off the train, and this would be terrible because India was on the way to becoming the third biggest emitter. They now are the third biggest emitter behind China and the United States. And the president was on the phone with Modi every day, keeping him on board. And that was actually instrumental. Again, if President Obama had not had this extraordinary commitment to getting the job done on climate change, Paris Accord would never have happened. Would never have happened.
Is it real? Do you think it's real if you see the actions now around the world?
Oh, I think it's real. Everybody knew at the time it's not enough. It's a first step. A lot of people have criticized Paris by saying, well, it won't solve the problem. Well, no single set of steps and nothing one can do between now and 2025 or 2030 will solve the problem in any final way. But we have to get on the right path.
Yeah, but I can say in the Netherlands, we are serious.
Yeah.
We are serious. And I wonder from where you're looking, how are other big countries? How serious are they?
China is very serious. Many of the other European countries are very serious. Mexico is serious. Brazil is serious. Indonesia is serious. Japan is serious. South Korea is serious. India has been, I would say, a few years behind China in their recognition of the dangers that climate change was posing to India, but they're now on top of it. And they have a climate advisory council to the Prime Minister that is constantly informing the Prime Minister and his other senior advisors of the latest climate science. They know climate change is already damaging to India. In the hottest parts of India, it is already impossible to work outside in the hottest months of the year. We, by the way, have to finish soon because
I would say, you know, you needed to get to the boat. That was my last thing. It's too bad because it's really very interesting to talk. Let me finish about what happened when you left. I mean, how does that feel to see Trump going as a bully through the porcelain shop?
The bull in the china shop. Yeah, no, that's been very painful. It's been painful for all of us who were engaged in trying to build up these initiatives, these advances in energy, in climate change, in health care, in immigration policy. I was even involved in immigration policy because high skills immigration is very important to the innovative capacity of the country. And to see all of this unraveled as rapidly as Trump and his deputies have been doing it is very demoralizing. And it's even more demoralizing for the president because, of course, not just the things that I was involved in, but all of the things he did. If he did it, Trump wants to dismantle it. And
why is that? Where does that come from? That incredible hate in what he has accomplished.
I think, number one, that Trump is a racist and was deeply unhappy that we had an African-American president. Trump, after all, was a major figure in what's called the birther movement, the people who were asserting that Obama wasn't even born in the United States and therefore was not entitled to be president. I think Trump also is unhappy about how much Obama accomplished as an African-American president. You know, people who worked with Obama never particularly thought of him as African-American. We thought of him as a brilliant leader. And it's unfortunate that sort of approach of just recognizing immense human talent in this individual and immense passion and commitment to making the world a better place, that's what's unique about the man, not the color of his skin. But in any case, there are people out there, and I include Trump among them, who never accepted that we could have an African American as a president of the United States.
So that's on the basis of the analysis.
Part of their response to that is to try to dismantle it. Now, other things that he did, some of the things that he did were things Republicans tend not to like. They don't like regulation, and because we couldn't get the Congress to help with a carbon tax or cap and trade, some of our approaches to dealing with climate change involved regulation. The approaches we took to dealing with other kinds of pollution involved regulation. And Republicans as a party tend to oppose that. But I need to tell you, there is a tremendous pushback in the wider society against what Trump is trying to do. With respect to climate change, we have what's called the America's Pledge, which has 1,000 corporations, 1,000 major American corporations. It has hundreds of cities. It has more than 20 states of the United States, many civil society organizations, hundreds of universities saying Trump may be withdrawing from Paris, but we're still in. Lots of action being taken in the United States by entities other than the federal government to address the climate change challenge, and that's encouraging.
On that note, go get a boat. Thank you very much for your time,
Thank
John,
you.
and thank you for the presentation.
Okay.